Welcome to the third NeuroMechFly video tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll cover how to compose a simulation with a fly and maybe a fly in a certain environment using the Python interface for NeuroMechFly. Specifically, we're going to follow the code tutorial notebooks available on the website here. Again, the current version of FlyGym is 2.1.0. Future versions might deviate from this video tutorial, so please always follow the tutorials on the webpage instead of following what I'm doing verbatim in this video. We have already covered 4 different ways to install FlyGym in the previous tutorial. Since we don't have a lot of computation going on in just composing the model, and we don't really care about performance, I'm just going to use Google Colab. I have already run the cell that installs FlyGym. You may need to start by connecting to an instance and clicking this button, and it might take some time. So, composing models and scenes. Basically, models in MuJoCo, the underlying physics simulation for FlyGym, has a format called MJCF, MuJoCo modeling format, that defines what's being simulated. Maybe we should clarify that the word model is a little bit ambiguous. We kind of use it interchangeably with simulation, but in the context of MuJoCo, in the context of MuJoCo, model refers to literally the set of things that are being simulated and their physical properties like surface friction. It does not contain dynamical information like forces and positions that you would read out when you actually run the simulation. The composition workflow of FlyGym is a high-level wrapper around MJCF. And it is exposed through flygym.compose. In this case, we start by initializing a fly. So we create a empty NeuroMechFly model, very straightforward. You can give it a name. By default, it's NeuroMechFly. And now we have an empty fly model with nothing attached to it. So next, we want to add some joints to it. And to add the joints, we need to have 2 pieces of information. First, we need to know what joints there are. This involves both knowing which anatomical joints there are. For example, is there a joint between those 2 leg segments? Is there a joint between the tibia and tarsus of a leg? But also joint degrees of freedom. So for example, is the joint between tibia and tarsus a ball joint where you can rotate in all 3 about all 3 axes? We know this is not true. In fact, it's a 1 degree of freedom joint where it acts more like a hinge instead of a ball joint. So this kind of information needs to be defined. Another thing that needs to be defined is the convention on the ordering of different rotational axes. If you want to go deeper into this mathematically, the reason why this is important is that 3D rotations, as you can see on this Wikipedia page, 3D rotations do not commute. So the ordering of them is actually important. Additionally, once we have decided which joints we want to add, we also want to add joint articulation, meaning that we find a subset of joints that we want to actively control, as in actively apply forces to, instead of using only their passive properties like stiffness. We also want to define a neutral pose for the fly. So in order to do all of this, we want to implement a couple of things from FlyGym.anatomy. We have a lot of presets. So for most simulations, you can simply say, I want the axis order to be row first, pitch next, and yaw last. We want the joints to be the set of all biological joints. Biological meaning that, for example, if we look at the tibial tarsus joint, it is physically possible to have 3 rotational degrees of freedom, whereas biologically, the biological reality is that there's only one. From there, we can set up a skeleton of the fly. So we want to use the preset of joints, all biological joints, and this particular axis order. Next, we can set up a neutral pose. We already have some presets, but you can also supply a dictionary of different joint angles. Once we have the skeleton and the neutral pose set up, we can basically add them to the fly. I'll skip this cell block for now because it's not so crucial. To add the joints, we use the fly.addJoint method with a specification of the skeleton as well as the neutral pose. This cell block basically goes back to my point that 3D rotations do not commute. The ordering is important. So if we want to get the same, if we want to express the same neutral pose in row yaw pitch versus pitch row yaw ordering, we actually get different numbers. Okay, now we have created an empty fly and added joints to it. Excuse me. The next step is to add actuation to a subset of the joints. Once again, under FlyGym anatomy, we have provided a bunch of actuated presets for actuated degrees of freedom, namely all, which means all articulated joints. In this case, all biological joints will be actuated. Another option is legs only, so I'll activate all not activate but actuate active actuators to all joints that are on the legs. And there's also another option called legs active only. So the distinction between legs only and legs active only is that there are further joints on the legs that are not actively actuated, biologically speaking. So if we look at the tarsus joints, so tarsus is this last segment, you'll see that there are joints between different tarsal segments, but the biological reality is that it's soft. It has several segments, but every segment is so small that they are just quite compliant. So one thing that we can do if we had selected legs only is that these joints would be actuated as well, but a better way to do it is to use legs active only, which would give you only actuators at the other joints, but not here. It's important to note that maybe the biological reality is not so black and white because in fact there's a tendon called the long tendon that goes from the tip of the tarsus all the way up. So in a way, there is active actuation, but the actuation of this joint and these joints, it's just a little bit complicated. Anyway, in this case, we choose legs active only. We the actuated degrees of freedom preset is a filter. It depends on what joints um, exist in the first place when we added the joints. So we actually have to call this get actuated degrees of freedom method on the skeleton object. So if we run it, we say, okay, previously we have added all biological joints to the skeleton, and among these joints, we want to actuate all joints that are on the legs that are supposed to be active, and it's going to tell us that we have um, 42 actuated degrees of freedom, which is correct because the fly has 7 of them per leg and 6 legs. We can even run this to see a full list of them. If we just look at the left front legs, those are the 7 actuated joints or degrees of freedom. Body segments and joints and everything are semantically named. So the joints, for example, have their names have 2 parts separated by a hyphen. The first part is the parent body segment, and the second part is the child body segment. Excuse me, actually there are 3. So 3 hyphen separated parts. The first one is the parent, the second part is the child, and the third one is the axis. Within the body segment name, once again, we have 2 parts separated by an underscore. The first part indicates which broad body part it is. So like C stands for central, so things like the thorax, the head, whereas LF means left front leg. You can read about it in more details here. Okay, so now that we have selected 42 actuated degrees of freedom and stored them in this variable, we can actually add them to our fly model by calling fly add actuators. In this case, we want to add position actuators, which would allow us to, like in this demo, set view, set target positions. And the physics simulator is simply going to apply an appropriate amount of force subjected to those physical parameters that would bring the model closer to the desired state. We specify the gain. In this case, we use 50. Optionally, we can add sites to anatomical joints, which would make it easier to visualize where different body segments are. I'll simply run it and show you the result later. More importantly, we can add visuals to the fly. So far, the fly doesn't have any color, any texture. So we can call fly colorize simply to get a kind of visualization that looks more like this, and add a camera. In this case, we add a tracking camera. More information is described here, but in brief, the camera maintains an offside from the fly, but stays, it looks at the fly from the same global angle. So far, we have not run any physics simulation. We have only composed a fly with a camera attached to it. There's no simulation going on. There's no movement. And as I said, this is what is called a model in MuJoCo. We can export this model. We can save it. If we look at the file system, let's find and replace here. You'll see under demo output, a fly model folder where you have a bunch of STL files. Those STL files, they essentially shapes. And if we go down a bit, we'll see a XML file here. neuromechFly.xml. Yes, let's download it. For some reason it's using text shop to open it, but that's fine. And in this XML file, we'll see a serialized or written description of exactly what we have added. If you want to go into more information on what these are, you can follow a separate tutorial called 1B Advanced Model Composition. There's a more detailed description. But for now, what matters is that we have composed a model, we have saved it. Maybe you all see in some other physics simulation software that often you start from this folder with an XML file and a bunch of mesh files. This is also what we did until FlyGym 2.0.0. In our experience, we found that this way of procedurally composing a model is a little bit easier to version control, because what happens often with these saved model is that one person passes to their collaborator the XML file that I just showed you, and it's just not very readable. You don't know what the previous person changed, maybe by hand, and it just becomes confusing over time. Again, we can see some mesh files being generated and this XML file. Again, what we have done so far, the output of it is simply this XML file. This everything that we have done so far is it's basically a glorified way of generating this text file by code. What we need to do next is to actually compile the model to a format that can be actually simulated. To do so, we call fly.compile, which generates two things, a Mujoko model and a Mujoko data. MJ model is simply a compiled or a data structure, let's say, that contains information on the information that we have included, things like which joints, which degrees of freedom there are. And MJ data right now is an empty container that can contain dynamic data such as acceleration and forces and positions as we actually simulate the model. So now using this helper function, we can run a brief simulation using MJ model and MJ data. The detail of it is not so important for this tutorial. It's simply a way of showing what we have composed. So if we put what we have composed so far into an actual simulation, we can see that the fly initializes to a neutral pose, but because of passive finite stiffness of non-actuated joints, the abdomen is going to settle into a pose that is subjected to gravity. Compared to the demonstration shown here, you'll note that this fly is standing on some sort of ground, because if we move the legs, it's going to apply certain forces on the ground, whereas here it's just a fly. That's because we have so far only composed the fly and not the world that it has seen. So in the next section, we will add a world. The basic example is a flat ground world, where, well, we only have a single line of code. If you go to the API reference for NeuroMechFly, you'll see that there are different types of worlds. For example, we have the flat ground world, but we also have a tethered world and also complex terrain world. Like for example, environments with gaps in the ground. These are a little bit more advanced. You can see Um, you can see what these worlds look like in future tutorials. For example, this one. For the purpose of this tutorial, that we are not going to look too much into it. Anyway, so far we have composed the fly, we have composed the world. We can attach the fly to the world. Before we do that, we need to tell the model where you want the fly to be placed in the world. So we define a spawn position in millimeters, so 0.7 millimeter in height. So at the origin on the XY plane, but 0.3 millimeters above the ground. And we're also going to define a rotation. In this case, uh, just just no rotation, a unit rotation, specified in quaternion format. I'm not going to go into details for this. You can read up more about it here. And once we have defined those two variables, we also need to define what kind of contact we want between the fly and the ground. Again, we have provided under FlyGym anatomy presets for which body segments should be able to collide with the ground. The reason why we don't want every body segment to collide with the ground is that it's computationally expensive. For every pair of body segments or just objects that may collide, it introduces a certain computational cost. So if you're simply simulating walking, there's no need, for example, to compute for collisions between the head and the ground, or the head and the abdomen, which is why, or between different abdominal segments, which is why, by the way, if we reduce the stiffness, we can see the abdomen kind of running into the thorax, which is not supposed to happen. Anyway, what we are doing here is to filter out the collision pairs that we don't care about. I'm just going to run these two cells. And once we have defined the spawn position and spawn orientation, and also which which body segments should be in contact with the ground, we can add the fly to the world. Oh, actually, I was wrong in this preset. We do simulate the collision between the head and the ground. I think the reason for this is that we wanted to explore failure modes where the fly entirely just flips over, and then we don't want then collision between the major body segments and the ground becomes interesting or important. Like before, once we have attached a fly to the world, we can save the model, this time the world model, instead of a standalone fly. Once again, we can see the XML file. Its content looks like this. Once again, we can compile the model, this time compiling the world instead of just the fly, and preview the compiled model of the world with the fly in it in a very short simulation. As I demonstrated actually in a previous tutorial, you can run this command locally if you have downloaded or installed a FlyGym locally to see essentially what we have here. So one thing to note is that in the tutorial that I just went through, it's not possible to do everything that you might want to do with the simulated model. In fact, that is by design. We wanted to build a high level API for procedurally composing a fly, and by design, we didn't implement every function that would tune every parameter that you can in a Mujoco physics simulator. If you wish to do that, please follow tutorial 1B. I'm not going to actually go through it in Google Colab, but essentially, this tutorial tells you how you might want to do things like, for example, settings joint stiffnesses differently for certain joints, but not every joint. And also things like modifying physics parameters. In this case, if we massively reduce the frequency of the simulation or increase the time step of the simulation, then the physics simulation becomes very unstable. It also tells you how to add debug things, for example, a visualization of certain joints. I encourage you to look into this tutorial if you want to do anything that is not covered in the first notebook. Additionally, the API reference section of the NeuroMechFly documentation gives you a very complete explanation of exactly what you can do and what functions are exposed and what options are. And that's it. In the next tutorials, we'll actually cover how to run the simulation.